deeper truth that we're starting to call co-revelation. And I guess I want to talk about these times for a moment before I talk about some of the practices of co-revelation. I'm just going to give you 4 today. I think there are a lot more. We just want to give you 4 key ones. But I think that there's something about these times that is calling us to have a deeper practice that holds both commonality and difference. We know that things are not getting less complex, and so we keep defaulting to our simpler answers. And sometimes not that truth or difference or truth or commonality is simple to host. That is not true. But they're a way to host. You can come from the worldview of difference, or you can come from the worldview of commonality, and you have some certainty. This is ground to walk on. Co-revelation we've been thinking about as a river, right? A river to jump into. That will have you moving between the banks. It's the banks of the river are truth of commonality and truth of difference. These times ask us to take those things and go deeper with them. So one of the questions Kelly and I have been asking is, what's the next conversation in social justice you've been longing to have? Chris came to New York. We had a whole 3-day gathering on what's the next conversation in social justice you want to have. Because we've had a lot of conversations for a really long time on both of these banks, but what's the conversation in the river, right? So if we think about co-revelation as kind of that way of being that holds truth and commonality that we reveal together, right? There isn't an individual co-revelation. Then what are some of the practices? Do you want to say anything before I move into some of those practices, Kelly? No. And one of the practices is working in multiplicity, right? And I got that word from my dear friend Jerry Nagel, who's in Minnesota. And talking about letting all of who everyone is show up every time in the room, right? So that means, I don't know about you all, but I've been in rooms where we're talking about issues of diversity, and we start to go down the checklist. Do we have this group identified? Do we have this group identified? Do we have a member of this group and this group and this group? And that's okay for representation. It also, we need to understand, essentializes people to one characteristic. And so practicing multiplicity means we allow every part of a person to show up in every gathering we have. So we invite the parent, we invite the however I choose to identify today, which may be as a black woman, which may be as a biracial woman, which may be a Midwesterner. We invite that piece, that wholeness of people to show up every time. And what that means is we allow people to be different every time. Because we know in ourselves, in our own identities, some of us that have kind of first generation multiple backgrounds really, or feel ourselves on a spectrum of issues, can feel our identity shifting within even a day. Like we're really aware of that, but we all have that. We all shift in our identities every day. So how do we let that show up every time, let a different person show up every time, and welcome in their wisdom? And so that means when we're asking questions, we ask questions that invite the personal, not just the professional voice. We ask questions that invite not only who I see you to be, but who I may not know that you are. So we begin to formulate questions that invite in the multiplicity of every person in the room. And sometimes when we begin to talk about multiplicity, people will bring up the idea of safe space. And I am, after years of working in a very specific anti-violence movement, I'm not a big fan of safe space, actually. I think that it's a guarantee that has us move into control and has us doing things like setting ground rules and having conditions for people being able to be in the conversation. I'm not talking about physical safety. Yes, we absolutely need physical safety for people to move in the conversation. There's no doubt about it. That's what I do instead is talk about safe enough space. How can people show up in their multiplicity? How can we together make the space safe enough? Are there agreements, not ground rules? Are the cafe practices? Often the cafe practices help bring in safe enough space, and people feel okay with that. How do we need to be together? So I often bring up the idea that we live in a dangerous world. I live in Ohio, and host. Chris was beside a volcano at one point hosting. Like, we live in a world that is not safe. And so how do we make ourselves safe enough to be able to have the conversation? And to understand that safe enough also happens over time, right? So what's the conversation we can have the first moment we're in the room together is not the conversation we'll have 6 months down the line. And so there's something about, with multiplicity also, understanding that safe enough space is a shared, created space. It is not me at the front of the room telling you how we're going to make this safe space and making sure that happens. That is too much pressure. I have been in groups where I am responsible for the safety of people in the room. And it's an awful lot of pressure and a quick road to burnout. And I'm probably not that effective at it anyway. People just decided to keep each other safe, right? I said it was because of my ground rules, but they made some decisions, right, together. So there's something about inviting in multiplicity and developing safe enough space as a practice. Another practice, you'll notice there are a lot of kind of sacred words, co-revelation, but then other practice is grace. And I actually, my good close friend Phil Cass and I were talking about this as I kind of shared with him this model. I said, you know, there are an awful lot of sacred or religious words in here. And he said, well, that's because we're talking about the sacred here. We're talking about something that is deeper than commonality and difference. We are talking about what we can be together, and that is sacred. So another practice is grace. And that is very simply allowing ourselves to be human beings who have grown up in a society. We live in North America. All of us, I think most of us right now, are living, at least in North America. And we have learned some things that we need to unlearn. And sometimes we have to give ourselves grace and space to unlearn them together. And so that is what I come up against. The bank here, the bank of difference, says you have to agree with my analysis before we can do any work together, right? Not going to get anything done unless you agree with my analysis. The bank over here says you're not allowed to talk about difference. We actually are one common human family, and you're just being divisive, right? Grace says, you know what? It took, we'll just say, at least 400 years to create this racist system in this country. We're not going to fix it in this hour-long meeting. And no amount of ground rules is going to do that. So what is the grace we can give each other, the mistakes we can allow each other to make? Now, I am not saying that you move into spaces and let people tromp all over you and say whatever they want and be however they want to be, you know. Like, that's not it, actually. What I'm saying is we don't have to be so quick to take offense. So I was at a federal agency doing a training, or not training, we were doing conversation around race and gender issues at this federal agency. And you know, we'd made some plans for what activities we were going to undertake together to begin to address these issues. And I was hosting, and I wrote something up, and I said, okay, so I think we've agreed to do this, right? And somebody just jumped on me. We did not agree to do that. How did you get that idea? I never agreed to that. I said, wow, I just misspoke. I just misspoke. It's as simple as it was. And so I'm just going to ask you to give me a little grace. And she's like, oh, okay. Totally easy, right? We don't have to be trauma language, right? We don't have to have a hair trigger, right? We can say, wow, that hurt me, or that didn't work for me, but I don't have to throw you out of the conversation. Like, how can we give each other grace? And so sometimes when I'm in ongoing work, you know, I'm in this project now that'll be 2 years of work around ending hunger in Ohio. So we're going to, I like bold work, right? So we're going to be 2 years working on that problem. And we've got a core team of about, I know, look at me split.
2 crops.
We can do it. And we've got a core team of 15 people. And we have to invite ourselves to grace over and over and over and over, because we will continue and do. And I just got an email this morning. I thought, did you have to email me that way? Help me help you. Have a little grace. You know, so just moving into a little bit of grace with each other as a practice, right? Not as I'm a good person. and I'd like to give you grace, but as a practice with each other, right? Another, and maybe I'll call an open space on it because I really can't do this justice, but another thing I think is a key practice is the reconceptualization of power, is really thinking differently about power. And we have it right now that power is a zero-sum game, right? So we want to get it, or we want to share it, or we want to advocate for someone else to have it, but it's like a commodity, that there's a finite amount that we move around. And so I've started thinking about this way, like what if we started to think about power, not power over or power with? I guess I also, as an aside, want to say that when we talk about relationships, when I say that relationships are the key to making change, I'm not talking about collaborations. I'm talking about something that's kind of totally different than, collaborations are good things, no one's going to argue with that, right? But collaborations are often brought together because of funding or a project or an MOU you signed, or you be on my collaborative board, so I'll be on your collaborative board, or I'm talking about actually moving into real relationships. So when we talk about power with other people, we talk about power over, hierarchy. We all know that model. We talk about power with, which is often a collaborative model, but it's still acting as if power is finite. What if there was power among, right? That every person in this group had an infinite well of power we could dip into, and you dipping into your power actually helps me access more of my power. It's a reconceptualization of power. And I don't have many words around it. I don't quite get it, but it's in my mind, like that there's some different way. We have to be thinking about power as not a zero-sum game to be able to move into co-revelatory space. It can't be you give up a little so I get a little. It can't be I insist you acknowledge your privilege before we can do work together. Right? Or I insist you understand our co-power as human beings before we move forward together. Right? There's something fundamental about reconceptualizing power as a practice and how you do it together and how you're speaking about it together. So our good friend Manish has this whole write-up around power and gift culture and resourcing and friendship and power and how we're giving each other. But I think it's probably the future, right? It's that things are so complex right now that neither of these truths are sufficing. There is a different future that will have a different conceptualization of power. And then finally, as a practice, there's just a ton more I could say, but I just want to say, another practice is shared work, and I'm differentiating this. Did you all do the chaotic stepping stones yesterday? Okay. So I'm differentiating this. So I'm actually differentiating this from shared purpose, because often in hosting we will talk about needing a shared purpose as you move forward together. And I think if you can get to shared purpose, that is ideal and optimal, and most groups can get there. I think that's where you want to go. I have, however, been in groups where shared purpose is not necessary. And what we have is shared work. And so I'll give a really clear example. So I was doing some work in Detroit, and very diverse group of people in every way. We had landowners to university professors to social justice food activists. The shared work was transforming the food system of Southeast Michigan. That's what we could all come together around. We were not going to get to shared purpose because some folks thought that unless we addressed race in the system, anything we created was going to perpetuate a racist system, which is not going to be transformation, right? And they weren't necessarily interested in doing work that didn't address race as the center of food system inequity. And we had other people who were saying, something's got to transform in Southeast Michigan. If you all know the situation there, something's got to change there. And we were talking about survival, and they were saying, I don't care about that stuff. I do care about profit. I want my home to be profitable and a place where people are not fleeing. I want people to live here and to want to be here. And so we could not agree. The work was transforming the food system. The purposes were divergent, right? But we could have enough relationship to keep doing work together, right? This is this is where we were. We were allowing people to show up however they were each time. We were hopefully giving each other grace. This was not an easy process. We were talking about power differently. We were inviting in those folks that we didn't think we wanted in the door. Chris has a whole thing on invitation and context of invitation that I would love to get into right now, but I feel like we're getting on time. But there was some agreement on shared work. And where it came to 6 months in, not the second or third meeting, where it came to 6 months in is we agreed on 5 threads that would go through any work we did, one of which was racial justice, right? And one of which was triple P profit. People, profit. I'm so bad at business stuff.
Oh.
I'm sorry. It's like Earth.
No, triple.
Planet.
Triple bottom line.
No, but it's planet. You
It's
have to
planet,
really be
people.
about-
Yeah, they called it triple P profit. Yeah,
Planet,
right?
people,
But it was a P.
profit.
I don't know. Anyway, so we said these 5 threads, one of which was youth, would go through every bit of the projects, right? So we'd started by doing shared work for 6 months and eventually got to some sense of purpose together. It's not that we weren't moving that way, but it wasn't a precondition for doing the work together. Because sometimes you just got to get moving. Sometimes like we can talk about what it is, what are the conditions that will allow us to work together and get going the same way. Sometimes you just got to move, right? So shared work as a key practice, and sometimes that's what if I'm with a wildly divergent group, sometimes I'll just start with shared work. What is our work? What could we agree on in the work? And underlying this truth of co-revelation is uncertainty. Like we've said it before, but the truth of difference and the truth of commonality are banks to walk on. They have some substance. They have some, this is my ground, this is what I believe. Co-revelation has underneath it uncertainty. I don't know. We've never been at this time in this planet. Things are changing really fast on the ecological scale, on people coming together who have never been able to travel across the country. I was in Columbus, Ohio this morning. And, 3 hours ago I was in Columbus, Ohio. We're coming together in a way that we've never been able to. There is uncertainty in that, and we have to do this practice, do some embracing of uncertainty, right? And so that's why co-revelation isn't a path, it's a river, and it will change, and you'll go between the banks, and you might bump up against this one, and that's okay, and you might bump up against that one, but it's staying, what's the next step we can take together? And with that group in Detroit, I have been able to say, I don't know what we do next, friends. What do we think is the next step? That's it. I don't care about 6 months from now. I want to know what we're going to do in the next 10 minutes of this meeting, right? Just to get through that groan zone, to keep us in relationship. So, last thing, if uncertainty is underneath it, there need to be some questions. I think the co-revelation question, I think there are lots of questions, but the truth of difference, if you find yourself, because we tend to go on one bank or the other, if you find yourself being a difference person, then it's kind of like, what's the minimum you have to have in common with other people to do good work? Like, I think that for me is like, that's a question I'm constantly, and what's the minimum we have to have in common? Is it really that you have to agree with me on this, or what's the minimum? And if I'm a person who kind of commonality makes me light up, I think the question is, what do I need to see or hear or feel or understand? What do I need to be willing to see or hear or feel or understand about other people's experience? And then the co-revelation question is, what's the path that holds both of those truths? Thanks. You want to move this into conversation?
Yeah. Thank you. There's one, I think a segue, another one of the practices that we think about and that comes up is about the meaning making or language piece. And you can see where Tuesdays where we're playing with that, right? This is language. We're finding language for this, right? It's part of about finding a new path and a new way of thinking about it. So, and sometimes you can see that as with the analysis, the activist side analysis, how language, that one of those preconditions, like this is the language, this is how we're going to talk about it. So I think that's a segue into just doing some meaning making together around this, right? This is a map and practices, and how we're going to take some time like we did yesterday after the teach to break into groups. This would be 3. This is a good number. And and with that theme there's also a theme that we've been working with here about the simplicity and the knowing and the continuity that's here also. So our sense of this is that we've experienced co-revelation. That is not a new thing. We've had that experience of working together, making meaning together, finding that moment where what is the quote of how you say that? You said it earlier. Of what I can't co-revelation by myself, right? We know that that's in our bones. We've all had that experience. So why don't we take let's see the time right now. It's about 11:20, and lunch is at noon today. So we're going to ask folks to go into groups of 3, and there's pens, and I think stickies came out there, didn't they?
I think we'll get them at the end.
I thought stickies came out. I think that I walked out with them. And break into groups of 3, and if you want to take a full sheet of paper, that's fine. Kind of do the cafe thing, capture some of your thoughts. But go into a discussion around where this resonates with you, that experience. Tap into that experience, that knowing that you have of making meaning together, and that dance between commonality and difference, right? Where you've experienced that. Tell some stories into that place. And then as far as coming back to the group, we'll take about 20 minutes to do that in groups of 3, and then come back together and
Yeah.
yeah, and we'll just capture a few insights that we've been doing that folks want to name back for the earnings.